Constructing Racism from the White Female Perspective in Shirley Jackson's Flower Garden by Savannah Richardson from the University of North Alabama. The disappearance of Shirley Jackson from the literary canon is one of the great crimes committed in the world of literature, especially considering that this is the result of a critical unwillingness to connect her fictional work with her domestic collections. On closer inspection, the entirety of Jackson's work is united by a witty, acerbic, and haunting portrayal of 1950s society. Stanley Hyman, Jackson's husband, declared her work misunderstood in response to the people accusing her of being singularly invested in writing about personal, even neurotic fantasies. Hyman asserts that Jackson's work was actually a sensitive and faithful anatomy of our times, fitting symbols for our distressing world of the concentration camp and the bomb. Accordingly, Jackson's work often examines the roles community play in establishing, fostering, and enforcing hatred. This theme is featured prominently in The Lottery, which is arguably her most famous piece. The impact of this motif persists long after Jackson's lifetime, as we both study and bear witness to this phenomenon in our own history with events like the Salem witch trials or the Satanic Panic. It is only natural that Jackson, writing during the development and founding of the NAACP and the rise of the civil rights movement, explored the theme of racism as an extension. At one point in his career, Jackson's husband reached out to budding author Ralph Ellison to see if he was interested in his skills as a reviewer, but they quickly became friends rather than business associates. The two men found that they both loved folklore and mythology, and they bonded over their outsider status, even among the New York intellectual scene. In fact, in Arnold Rampersad's biography of Ellison, he went so far as to suggest that Invisible Man would never have been completed if he had not had the encouragement and assistance of Hyman. It is this relationship that likely inspired the contents of one of Jackson's more complex short stories about the influence of racism in small communities, titled Flower Garden. In the spring of 1945, Hyman accepted a job teaching at Bennington College in North Bennington, Vermont. When they moved to the area, Ellison continued to visit, often coming to lecture at the college on Hyman's request. However, Rampersad speculates that this may have been the first time anyone in their small community had ever seen a black man. He writes, the fact that he stayed with the Hymans made him almost as sinister as the fact that he was black. This exact sentiment is mirrored in Flower Garden when newcomer Mrs. MacLane moves to a small town in Vermont only to be ostracized by the community for employing and befriending Mr. Jones, a black man. This story is unique because it is told from the third-party perspective of Mrs. Winning, a young woman that married into the oldest and most influential family in town. I argue that using the white female perspective to construct a portrait of small-town racism is specifically a Jacksonian move because it capitalizes on the insidious potential lurking in one's own community to continually reinforce oppression, even at the expense of the enforcer. To demonstrate this, I first examine the development of the housewife character, as it is essential that the rules defined by Mrs. Winning's status be understood. This is because she too is a victim of her community's expectations. Next, I explore the unique brand of horror being deployed in this story. That is the idea that one's worst enemy resides within the self, not as a foreign invasion or threat. Finally, I assess the way that domestic expectations and insidious social cues are used in Flower Garden to demonstrate that as long as survival and social consciousness are linked, racism will continue to prevail in this Vermont community. While her relationship with her own mother was a great influence on her writing, the most important angle that Jackson wrote from was born out of the tenuous, even comical status she occupied as a mother, writer, and intellectual. Franklin writes that, in the literary circles she and Stanley were a part of, having children was considered unusual. Midge Decter, a friend of Jackson and Hyman, once said that, in their circle, it was extremely hard for women to admit that they wanted children in a home because it was not a part of the bohemian lifestyle. This sentiment also went the other direction, as women in the 1950s, especially mothers, were not meant to have careers. In a now famous anecdote told in Life Among the Savages, Jackson arrives at the hospital to deliver her third baby when a nurse asks her to name her occupation. When she says writer, the nurse says, "I'll just put down housewife." This approach to motherhood, or the housewife, is pervasive in both her fiction and domestic collections and is representative of a shift in identity formation first explored by David Reisman, Nathan Glazer, and Ruel Denny in their novel The Lonely Crowd. In her article, A Faithful Anatomy of Our Times, Reassessing Shirley Jackson, Angela Haig explains that The Lonely Crowd characterized the 1950s as a transition from a phenomenon called inner-directed identity formation to something called outer-directed identity formation. Inner-directed identity formation is based on the idea that people make choices from the perspective of an individualized persona, whereas outer-directed personality formation is dictated by the opinions of others. Importantly, outer-directed identity is considered remarkably aware of the actions and wishes of others. The fallout of this development is a central focus of Jackson's work, as many women that fall prey to the derisiveness of the outer-directed identity of the housewife eventually find themselves driven insane by a total absence of self. Roberta Rubinstein masterfully examines this issue in House Mothers and Haunted Daughters, Shirley Jackson and Female Gothic. She identifies a series of tensions represented in Jackson's work, though for the purposes of this paper we will focus solely on the home-lost pairing. Rubinstein explains that, as women labor under the restrictions of the housewife character, a desire to break free from the bonds of suburbia and their daily monotony begins to take over their consciousness. Yet, when women leave the safety of their homes, they run the risk of being lost, so they must pick between the unknown and potentially endless threats of the outside world or the safety/imprisonment of their households. Haig points out that this specific issue is most prominent in Jackson's short stories, Pillar of Salt, A Day in the Jungle, and The Tooth. All of the women in these stories break away from their suburban prisons for one reason or another and find themselves lost in the city. They all experience a mental breakdown spurred on by the loneliness, boredom, and psychic emptiness of women whose roles were strictly limited to those of wife and mother. In the end, they are all rescued by their husbands and returned to the safety of their homes. It is important to note that in Jackson's texts, the housewife identity responsible for such emotional turmoil is unique to white women. In fact, she intentionally uses a caricature of these women to highlight the fact that white women in 1950s society did not believe that black mothers were capable of fulfilling the demands of the housewife role. While this is meant to be a critique of a specific type of falsely liberal racism, it also means that racialized others are considered an affront to Jackson's white mothers. This is clearly demonstrated in her short story, After You, My Dear Alphonse. At the center of the story is Mrs. Wilson, a typical housewife, gingerbread and all. One day she is surprised to find that her son Johnny has brought his friend Boyd home for lunch. The only problem is that Boyd is black. While she appears welcoming, her racism quickly emerges in the form of poorly disguised politeness. She assumes that Boyd's father must be a strong man because he cannot possibly do anything other than manual labor if he even works at all. Except Boyd's father is actually a foreman at a factory. She also assumes that the boy is malnourished and is genuinely surprised to find out that his mother is a housewife just like her. She insinuates that Boyd must have a lot of siblings, only to find out that it is just him and his sister Jean. At the end of the story, she offers Boyd some of Johnny's old suits and suggests that his mother and sister could use her old dresses. The little boy explains that his mother does not sew, as they buy most of their clothes, and furthermore, they do not really need them. The crux of this story is when Mrs. Wilson tells Boyd that she is disappointed in him for not accepting her generous offer. This is because she expects Boyd and his family to embody certain racially driven stereotypes. As Alexis Shotwell says in her article, No Proper Feeling for Her House, The Relational Formation of White Womanliness in Shirley Jackson's Fiction, Mrs. Wilson requires the performance of self-denigration and gratitude from racialized others. She is surprised when she finds out that Boyd's mother does not need or even desire her help, which is disrespectful to her superior status. Her reaction highlights the fact that this story, like Flower Garden, is really about Mrs. Wilson's racial identity being defined in proximity to Boyd's blackness. Post-war America, Jackson's most prolific period, is easily categorized by widespread fear and suspicion and is commonly referred to as the Age of Anxiety. The source of this agitation was linked to the nation's growing fear of communism, the alien/foreign, and the ever-present threat of nuclear attack. What is unique about these concerns is that they represent something speculative and unknowable. As a result, the enemy is no longer tangible or recognizable. It permeates borders and invades one's community, neighborhood, and even their home. In reassessing Shirley Jackson, Haig argues that the fear that pervades much of Jackson's fiction is the terror of what is unseen and unacknowledged. The enemy cannot be confronted because it inhabits a world that lies hidden but dangerously close by, often within the individual herself. One example of this type of horror is found in Jackson's 1954 novel, The Bird's Nest. In this text, it is revealed that a young woman named Elizabeth Richmond is secretly suffering from multiple personality disorder. After she is coerced into visiting Dr. Wright, a psychiatrist, it is revealed that she has several distinct personalities. One of these identities, Betsy, is a literal culmination of all the negative aspects of Elizabeth. Under hypnosis, she informs Dr. Wright that her sole objective is to eliminate the other personalities and take over Elizabeth's body. The only problem is that would likely kill her, which is why Dr. Wright likens Betsy to a demon in possession of Elizabeth. The bird's nest is an essential piece in Jackson's oeuvre because it exemplifies the way she intentionally manipulates the traditional good versus evil dynamic. Rather than identify a knowable, palpable threat, the villain of the piece is literally embodied in the hero. In this novel, Jackson uses the paranoia of post-war America to caricature the idea of the enemy next door by suggesting that the real enemy resides within the self. Again, this is the idea that no one is innocent or safe as long as they are the source of their own evil. It is established in the first section of Flower Garden that young Mrs. Winning is turning into her mother-in-law. This is important because replacing the matriarch of the most respected family in town must be done meticulously and carefully to preserve the Winning name. The replacement must know what is expected of her status, and nothing less than an exact replica will suffice. Jackson indicates that this is what we are witnessing at the beginning of the story by referring to both women as Mrs. Winning and not by their first names. The Winning women also tend to mirror one another's physical actions. At the opening of the story, Jackson describes them as being so in tune with one another they can communicate with just their hands more easily and sympathetically than their minds ever could. The younger Mrs. Winning's hair is even said to be going gray in the same spot her mother-in-law started, despite no genetic link. What is important about this transition is that the elder Mrs. Winning is supposed to be the perfect embodiment of the housewife, even outweighing all the other housewives in the story. It then stands to reason that the younger Mrs. Winning's assumption of this position in the family must follow those rules associated with the housewife to the letter. These rules appear indirectly throughout the entirety of the text, starting with Mrs. Winning's initial trip to the grocery store. For context, Mrs. Winning explains that she was once infatuated with the head grocer Tom. However, she belonged now to the Winning family and had to speak critically to him, no matter how unwillingly, if the meat were tough or the butter price too high. This informs the reader that the Winning family expects nothing less than the best the small-town grocer has to offer, and the younger Mrs. Winning is responsible for maintaining this demand. Furthermore, it reveals that when Mrs. Winning decided to marry into the family, it was assumed that she would abandon her former self, friends and all. By using the term unwillingly, we inadvertently extrapolate that the previous Mrs. Winning was once a forgiving person. She is no longer allowed to indulge in this kind of weakness. The second rule we encounter is when Mrs. Winning spontaneously decides to stop by the cottage to see if the new family needs any help moving in. Once inside, she apologizes for the intrusion and asks Mrs. MacLane if she is being a nuisance. After this comment slips out, the narrator reflects, saying it had been a very long time since young Mrs. Winning had said the first thing that came into her head. From this we can discern that, at the Winning manor, Mrs. Winning is not allowed to speak freely. Her thoughts must be carefully considered if they are even said at all. Thus, Winning women are there strictly to provide a service for Winning men. The following housewife rule is revealed to the reader with the understanding that Mrs. Winning is conscious of the oppressive role she has subsumed. After Mrs. Winning meets Mrs. MacLane, she rushes home to make sure dinner is on the table in time for her family. That night she finds herself thinking more poignantly than ever before that she had at least given them another Howard, with the winning eyes and mouth, in exchange for her food and bed. The impact of this thought is rooted in its antiquarian nature. Despite the time period, it is still expected that a woman of Mrs. Winning's stature provides male children, which means she is nothing more than a cooking, cleaning, and breeding tool to the Winning men. In the beginning of Flower Garden, Mrs. Winning is aware of these rules, though she has not fully subsumed her role as matriarch of the family. While she is expected to perform accordingly, she still holds on to a sense of romanticism from her previous life. She remembers a time when she wanted to buy Mrs. MacLane's cottage and fantasizes about moving her family inside, decorating, painting, and planting a garden. This awareness, as mentioned, is noted when Mrs. Winning acknowledges that her real unspoken purpose is to provide male children. However, when Mrs. MacLane agrees to hire Mr. Jones, she violates one of the most important social cues of this community. White women are not supposed to interact with black men. This is exemplified when Mrs. Winning tells Mrs. MacLane about Mr. Jones's son, Billy. She says that Billy's mother was a white woman who moved in with Mr. Jones, and together they had 3 children. Then one day, she left the whole litter of them when Billy was about 2 and went off with a white man. The term litter implies that Billy's mother is more animal than human, and this is directly linked to her transgression. By using this kind of terminology, Mrs. Winning insinuates that any interaction with Mr. Jones is tainted, especially if a white woman is the initiator of this relationship. Later, when Mrs. Winning's mother-in-law asks her about Mrs. MacLane hiring Mr. Jones, Mrs. Winning explains that she just needed help with her garden. Mother Winning then says not that kind of help and asks if she explained who the Joneses were to Mrs. MacLane. As expressed by the elder Mrs. Winning, it is understood that people in their community do not interact with Mr. Jones or his family. This gets to the real issue of this story, Mrs. MacLane's willful neglect of the social expectations practiced by the elder Mrs. Winning and thus the community. As soon as Mrs. MacLane hires Mr. Jones, the younger Mrs. Winning, who knows something is wrong, reassigns to transgression. More than once she finds herself thinking, I wish he'd ask me first. By doing this, the issue is not Mr. Jones's blackness so much as it is Mrs. MacLane's indiscretion. Instead, racism is used to weed out those not capable of following the outer-directed characteristics demanded by this small town in Vermont. It is now Mrs. MacLane's fault, not necessarily Mr. Jones's, and this is why Mrs. MacLane is the one Mrs. Winning directly punishes. For her part, Mrs. Winning realizes that her association with Mrs. MacLane is putting her own standing at risk when Mr. Burton calls by the manor one night. He promptly asks Mrs. Winning to do something about Mrs. MacLane's involvement with the Jones family. After Mrs. Winning thinks, I've got to do something, pretty soon they'll stop coming to me first. They'll tell someone else to speak to me. If Mrs. Winning cannot communicate to Mrs. MacLane the issue at hand and/or disassociate herself from the situation, the community will inevitably conclude that the young matriarch is just as compromised as the newcomer. Following this incident, Mrs. Winning finds herself similarly cornered by Mrs. Burton in the grocery store. She asks Mrs. Winning if Howard would like to come to her son's birthday party. Mrs. Winning accepts the invitation, but Mrs. Burton follows this inquiry by asking Mrs. Winning if it's okay that she does not invite Davy, Mrs. MacLane's son. The fact that this moment occurs in a public space is no coincidence, especially considering that the grocery store is the epicenter of town gossip. Mrs. Burton, representing the social consciousness of their community, is really asking Mrs. Winning to declare to the public that she is still one of the quote-unquote nice people. Before replying, Mrs. Winning thinks something bad has happened. Somehow people think they know something about me that they won't say. They'll all pretend it's nothing, but it's never happened to me before. I live with the Winnings, don't I? Mrs. Burton's question goes so far as to make Mrs. Winning feel sick, as she realizes that her association with the compromised has begun to infect her own status, and, as a member of the Winning family, this is completely inappropriate. The other interesting aspect of this thought is the line, people think they know something about me that they won't say. As Shotwell points out, women in Jackson's fiction are controlled by social expectations, tacit understandings, and habituated relations. Mrs. Winning's thought suggests that towns like this one communicate in a coded way, but considering Mrs. MacLane has to ask Mrs. Winning why the town has rejected her, the kind of information being disseminated through these tacit understandings requires conscious participation and observation. In other words, women properly gendered by their social reality and expectations understand what is not being said. They are sensitive to the opinions of others and adjust accordingly. Following the incident at the grocery store, Mrs. MacLane finally decides to confront Mrs. Winning, who responds by stonewalling her suspicions. Again, the fact that Mrs. MacLane cannot understand or will not engage with the secret language of the community isolates her, and Mrs. Winning's feigned ignorance is meant to embarrass her for being so forward. In this moment, Mrs. Winning's inner thoughts reveal that the choice to protect herself against Mrs. MacLane, and therefore Mr. Jones, represents the final stage of her transformation into her mother-in-law. She realizes that not only does she sound like Mother Winning, she enjoys being cruel just as she would. It also indicates her final assumption into the hideous, monstrous thing that is her community. When she leaves Mrs. MacLane's, she thinks, the nerve of her, trying to blame the colored folks. Again, this reveals that Mr. Jones's blackness is almost incidental in light of Mrs. MacLane's crime against the community. She willfully broke the rules of her position and abandoned her whiteness. As such, she must face what Mrs. Winning cannot, being banished back to the city. From earlier, we understand that this landscape is associated with the lost, as it is the site of intense emotional turmoil for many of Jackson's housewives. That said, Mrs. Winning always had a choice. At the start of the story, she romanticizes and longs for the options she had before it came to this point. She remembers her infatuation with the grocer and the fact that she once wanted to buy Mrs. MacLane's cottage. But the Winning family is inextricably linked with tradition, and as the oldest family, they are the foundation of the community. While there are certainly advantages to this kind of security, she inevitably becomes her own biggest threat. Like several of Jackson's other characters, i.e. the Blackwood sisters, Mrs. Winning willfully imprisons herself. She will remain in the manor, groom her daughter to take her place, and, as a result, ensure that the same crime is perpetuated over and over again. In the final pages of Flower Garden, a massive tree branch falls into the beautiful garden Mrs. MacLane and Mr. Jones have spent the entire summer working on. The tree branch is the ultimate symbol of futility, as neither are capable of moving it. It is also poignant that the branch came from a tree in the yard of the Burton home because this is the family that forced Mrs. Winning to defend her status in the grocery store. Now that Mrs. Winning has essentially become her mother-in-law and she has been fully consumed by the nebulous evil that is her community, we understand the truly awful thing that is small-town racism. In this text, it is inevitable that people will conform to the strictures of their community because they cannot or will not face the alternative. Mr. Jones will never be able to get rid of the tree branch, which is why Mrs. MacLane decides to let the next people that move in deal with the problem. Over the course of this paper, we examine the development of the housewife character in 1950s post-war America. The move from inner-directed to outer-directed personality formation meant that people started carving out their place in society according to the will and opinions of others, rather than developing those things on their own. Set against the backdrop of suburbia, the psychic unrest and lack of any real identity of their own lead to emotional instability for many women. Jackson embodies this issue in several of her short stories, where women decide to escape home/prison for the promise of city/freedom. Yet this always ends with them being rescued by their husbands. In the city, these women are disoriented and unable to combat the home/loss tension that led to their emotional upheaval in the first place. Instead, they return to suburbia and spend the rest of their days processing demanding, highly gendered social cues. We then look at how Jackson locates danger. In her narratives, the villain or the threat is never far away. This comes in the form of community, family, and importantly, the self. In Flower Garden, community becomes the villain as it takes on the role of enforcing insidious social cues at the expense of others. Namely, the story deals with the issues of white women interacting with black men. However, the real villain in this piece is Mrs. Winning. Despite having a choice, she allows herself to be consumed by the community and transformed into her mother-in-law. She is responsible for ostracizing Mrs. MacLane, and in doing so reinforces the community's attitude towards Mr. Jones and his family. Yet in the end, she is the one who will suffer the most. By conforming to these strictures, she imprisons herself in the Winning manner. She will never have the life she romanticizes at the beginning, and, what is worse, she will force the same fate on her daughter, ensuring that the cycle continues. In the last section, we establish the social expectations of the housewife character, which are dictated by Mother Winning. This is because her family are the oldest and most influential in town. Her example sets the precedent for all the other women in the community, and engaging in any relationship with the Jones family is simply not done. When Mrs. MacLane hires Mr. Jones, she is in direct violation of Mother Winning, and it falls to Mrs. Winning to either end this relationship or completely separate herself from it. The problem is that Mrs. MacLane cannot understand or will not engage in the coded communication of the quote-unquote nice people. After Mrs. MacLane fails to infer what Mrs. Winning mentally wills her to understand, Mrs. Winning is left with no other choice than to completely cut off their friendship. When she makes this choice, she is essentially swallowed whole and becomes one more member of the monstrous entity that is the small Vermont community.